Bonjour, my friends. Tomato, tomato. Or Monet, Manet in our case. Welcome to another articulating talk. I'm coming to you from my backyard on a lovely spring day. It's a little hot. Hopefully you won't hear any dogs barking or birds interfering. And we're going to start today with this picture that is done by neither Monet nor Manet. I wanted to clarify though, because when I asked my husband if he knew the difference between Monet and Manet, he said no, but didn't Manet die of syphilis? Yes, Manet died of syphilis, but there's a lot more between Monet and Manet. Hopefully we can clear that up today so that you'll know the difference. This picture actually has both Monet and Manet incorporated into it. This is a picture called Studio at Batignolles. It was done in 1870 by Henri Fantin Latour, and it was painted as an homage to Manet, but it includes other impressionistic artists of the day. We have Manet here sitting at the easel, hard at work. We have Monet actually hiding here in the background, but he is included in this picture. And I don't know who the other artists are, but I do know that this is a group of artists, Impressionist artists, who were working together and discussing art and spending a lot of time together in Paris in the 1870s. So this picture again does have Manet at the easel, Monet in the background, and all the other Salon Refusé artists gathered together here. I have a quote. It says, "Monet began by imitating Manet, and Manet ended up by imitating Monet." That was a quote by an Irish art critic. So yes, everybody's a little confused about Monet and Manet. But I will talk about each artist individually, and then we will compare and contrast them, okay? We've talked about Claude Monet before, but I want to go ahead and give you a brief review of him and his style. French, of course. His proper name is Oscar Claude Monet, but we only know him as Claude Monet. Born in 1840, dies in 1926. He moves to Paris at the age of 19 to study art. He observes the art that's on display at the Louvre. He starts to talk to all these other artists that are in Paris at the time. He befriends people like Camille Pissarro, Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and eventually Manet. He goes away in 1861 to serve in the military in Algiers and then returns to Paris. He, Renoir, Sisley, Basile, a bunch of the Impressionist artists then begin to study with Charles Gleyre. And Charles Gleyre was teaching them to paint plein air style. Plein air, of course, means that you are painting outside in the fresh air. And that all came about because oil paints were now available in a portable fashion, in tubes. They came in small tubes, just like they do today. So that untethered the artists from working in their studios and allowed them to paint outside. So this created a whole new movement. That's why Impressionism is so different than the art that came before that. Impressionism starts to gain critical acclaim, although people aren't really sure what to make of it. It's a pretty big pull away from the art that had been produced before that. The more realistic portraits, the subject matter, of course, becomes different. It's not all about religious and saints and portraiture anymore. Now it's about light and color, and this is very different. Monet marries Camille in 1870. They run away to London so that he will not have to serve in the military again during the Franco-Prussian War. And that's where he meets Paul Durand-Ruel, who becomes his art dealer. Now, it turns out that Manet will also become a client of Durand-Ruel, so there's something in common right there. Camille and Claude returned to Paris after the war in 1872. Their friendship with all of these others, including Manet, forms a society, and the society is called the Société Anonyme des Artistes, Painters, Sculptors, and Graveurs. But we'll just call it the Salon of the Refused. And they're called the Salon of the Refused because the traditional Paris salon, which is where anybody that's anybody is going to be an artist, refuses to exhibit their work. So the Salon Refusé is formed in order to have an exhibition space for these other artists. They've essentially been shunned by the Paris Art Society. So Manet, Renoir, Courbet, Monet, Pissarro, all exhibit in this Salon des Refuses. I want to show you our first picture today. Again, we've talked about this picture before. This is one of Monet's very early works. It's called The Poppy Field. And of course, we have these red dots that represent the poppies. We have Camille here and son Jean, who's about 7 or 8 years old in this picture, romping through the poppy fields, right? Now, this picture is one of the very first Impressionist pictures, although we will see Monet's style develops to be even more impressionistic and less figurative and less realistic as his career progresses. But the poppy fields here was painted in 1873 while they were living in Argenteuil, and it was on exhibit in this first Salon Refusé in 1874. We have two very distinctive planes. We have the sky, which represents the upper half of the picture. We have the bottom half here, which is the field. We have some trees that kind of break up those two planes, but it's two very distinctive areas in this picture. We do not have a real strong perspective. We have some perspective, but again, not realistic, not meant to be realistic. And this was probably one of his first pictures that he painted outdoors, plein air style. We have the sun coming from up here in the top right, shining this way. It's a little bit of a windy day. We can see a little bit of motion in the trees and in the flowers in the field. And she's got her parasol, although her parasol is not up overhead, which makes sense since it's not a really bright sunny day in the picture, right? So this was one of the early ones. But the very first picture that we actually credit with the term Impressionism, let alone the fact that it was impressionistic, is this one. This is Impression Sunrise, and this was done in 1874. Now, you can automatically see a difference in the style between the poppy field and Impression Sunrise. Impression Sunrise is much blurrier, right? We always think of blurriness when we think of Impressionism. A lot of short brush strokes are evident here. We have a sun, obviously rising, hence the name, Impression Sunrise, over some water. And a critic had looked at this picture and said, this is not a painting, this is just an impression of a painting, hence the term Impressionism. That is literally where some of these terms come from, when a critic just flippantly applies it to a picture or to a work of art. So Impressionism actually came out of the critic using that term. This is a picture of Le Havre in the morning fog. It's a harbor scene. We have a lot of very strong colors. We don't have too much blending. We have a little bit of blending in the sky, but we have the reflection of the sun here in the water shown by very short, bold strokes. We have movement in the water, again, shown by short, bold strokes. This piece did not sell. People were very interested in it because it was so different, but it didn't sell. It was one of the first times that they had seen this style of painting. It really isn't of anything other than an outdoor scene. I think we would call this a landscape for sure. But this is the picture that basically designated Claude Monet as the father of Impressionism. Okay. Japanese work had started to come into Europe at this point by ships in trade, and the Japanese style of art was a really strong impression, on Monet and the other impressionistic artists. The use of color, the use of a very flat perspective, those things all came into play in Japanese art, and these impressionists were so excited by it that they incorporated it into their own work. We're going to see some of that with Manet as well. So we have a Japanese influence that's starting to influence Monet. In the 1890s, he starts to paint series of things. Why? Because Impressionism is becoming all about light and about capturing a moment in time. And so by setting up multiple canvases, he was able to paint the light for 20 minutes here, and for 20 minutes here, and for 20 minutes here. And so that kind of lent itself to him painting series of objects. So he did, for example, a series of the Rouen Cathedral in France, He did 26 different images of the Rouen Cathedral using different times of the day, different reflections of light, and different color and shadows. He did haystacks. We've all seen the Monet haystacks pictures. He did his famous water lilies, of course. And he was trying to convey the lighting at a particular time of day and the sensations that came with that. So here we have one of his water lily pictures. Now, look at the difference between this and that. His style has evolved quite a bit, right? So here, this is one of the water lilies pictures from his series done in 1899. He did about 250 oil paintings of the water lilies. So talk about doing a series, right? That's quite a series. He's had a Japanese bridge installed in his garden. He's built this garden in Japanese fashion so that he can paint these beautiful water lilies. And the early lily pictures are divided with a horizon line, kind of like our poppy picture was. In this one, we have no sky. We really don't have a perspective. We are actually kind of in the water, in the picture. He's got these willow branches drooping down, and those kind of frame the picture. He's got the water lilies blossoming here in the water. That's kind of our floor of the picture. But we really don't have any skyline. We're sort of incorporated into it. He's focusing on the pond surface. And he did a series of these particular pictures with this particular perspective. They were gifted to the museum in Paris, the L'Orangerie, in 1927, and you can still see them there today. So we have definitely seen a style shift in Monet throughout his career. This was the style that he ended his career with. This was the style that he began his career with. But we would definitely lump all of those into Impressionism, okay? In December of 1926, Claude Monet dies of lung cancer, and he says, "My only merit lies in having painted directly in front of nature, seeking to render my impressions of the most fleeting effects." This opens the door for further abstract art to come way later. And in the 1950s, Monet's style is kind of rediscovered, and his value is definitely given more credence by art curators and artists. Okay, now we're going to move on to Edouard Manet. Okay. Edouard Manet, M-A-N-E-T, unlike Monet, M-O-N-E-T, but both French. Edouard is born in 1832, dies in 1883, and born to a wealthy family. The family wants him to be a lawyer. Edouard is not very interested in that, and so he objects. Then he decides to try to be in the military. He'll be a naval officer, but he's rejected from that twice. So from that point on, the family allows him to go ahead and study art. He starts to travel, as most wealthy art students would have done. He starts to copy the old masters. He spends a lot of time at the Louvre. He goes to Italy to study the sculptures and the great works there. And he becomes very moved emotionally by the works of Velázquez and Titian. And we'll see that in some of his works later. He develops a relationship with Berthe Morisot. You might recall Morisot was one of the only female Impressionist painters of the day. And we don't really know what kind of relationship he had with her. We do know that they were very close. Now, we don't know if they were like really close or just close. But anyway, Morisot paints him, he paints Morisot, and if any of you were at the exhibition that was recently at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Houston, you saw that he appears in some of Morisot's work. Anyway, Morisot ends up marrying his brother, Eugene, and so I guess their friendship continues, whatever that was. Meanwhile, Edouard does marry his longtime lover and former piano teacher from when he was a child, and they have a son. Now, the son is technically hers. We don't know whether the son was Edouard Manet's or not, but he adopts him as his own, so there's that. Charles Baudelaire becomes friends with Manet and urges him to become a painter of modern life. So this is huge because we're going to see the big differences between Manet and Monet are that Manet is depicting scenes of everyday life using everyday people, whereas Monet, of course, is focusing more on light and landscape. So that alone is probably the biggest difference between Manet and Monet. Manet focuses more on people, and Monet focuses more on being outside and landscape and light. Okay? So Manet's first well-known work is called The Absinthe Drinker. And here it is. It's a rather dark picture, don't you think? And this one was done in 1859, and it's a portrait of a drunk rag picker. So no glamour there, nothing real impressionistic there. And this picture is refused for exhibition at the Paris Salon, because why would anybody want to look at a picture of a drunk rag picker? So that's the end of The Absinthe Drinker. He then, of course, joins the Salon Refusé artists. Manet and Monet are now together with Renoir and Sisley and all the others we discussed earlier. Napoleon actually helps the artists put together an exhibition space for the Refusé. Why? Well, we think that maybe Napoleon did it as a way of shaming them, whereas, of course, that backfired very badly. So in 1863, the Salon de Refusé opens shortly after the Paris Salon has their annual exhibition. People are drawn to it because it's kind of considered a freak show. It would be like going to a carnival to see the three-headed lady. They are going to go see the work of art that is so different than what they just saw at the Paris Salon. And of course, it had drummed up quite a bit of news because Napoleon had backed this. So as part of the Salon Refusé, Manet displays this work. This is called Olympia. This is painted in such a very different style than what we looked at with Monet, don't you think? We have outlines. We have a lot of strong color use. We don't have any blending of colors at all. And we actually have a scene that we can narrate. And, oh, by the way, we have a naked lady. So let's talk about this particular picture. He is ridiculed with this picture. It is extremely provocative. People are very upset because to this point, female nudes have either been idealized or used allegorically or painted as goddesses. Well, this young lady, of course, is none of those things. She is staring at the viewer in a very confident manner. And she's got a servant woman here in the back bringing flowers. What we think is going on here is that the woman is actually a prostitute, and she's being brought these flowers by the servant woman, the flowers coming from an admirer or a client of hers. But the fact that she is blatantly on display for all of us to see, she's lying in a lovely bed with blankets and shoes. There's the idea of wealth. She's clearly unashamed of her nakedness. And the servant woman is not fazed by seeing her in this position. So this was an extremely unusual subject matter. It was very different than the typical impressionistic subject matter. And so people started talking, right? Now, we talked about the fact that Manet was influenced by Titian. This particular picture can be attributed to Titian's Venus of Urbino painting, which I don't have an example, but you can certainly look that up online. It also brings to mind Goya's painting of the naked Maja, which was done. But in this particular painting, what makes this an impressionistic work? Well, we definitely have some Japanese influence in the perspective. We don't have any receding background, right? Everything is kind of up in the front of this picture. We have very strong visible brush strokes like we have in Impressionism. And we have outlines which contradict the realism. So if this was painted in a realistic fashion, we'd have very strong outlines. Here we don't have this. It's almost like a photograph, right? The painter should be invisible, they thought, before Impressionism came along. But here in this picture, we have evidence of the painter's hand. This is unusual and this is new, and this is a characteristic of Impressionism. So this was displayed along Impressionism's sunrise, and Monet and Manet were actually exhibited next to each other, which caused a bit of confusion People actually thought that this was done by Monet, not Manet, even though this had been ridiculed at the time. So the other work that was exhibited at this Salon des Refusés is this one, Luncheon in the Grass, or if you're French, you could say Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And this was done in 1863. Both Olympia and Luncheon in the Grass are on exhibit at the Musée d'Orsay. This picture in real life, an oil on canvas of course, is very large. It's about 7 foot by 9 foot. So it would be a pretty encompassing picture if you walked into the gallery to see it. And this is based on a classical painting, perhaps by Titian, and Manet himself referred to this as bathing. The picture was referred to as bathing. That's the working title, for lack of a better term. We have a very flat perspective. Again, there's that Japanese influence. We have unidealized nudes. These women are not glamorous or graceful, but they're very naked, right? And we have strong contrasting colors. We have a lot of black and white. Manet did not shy away from using black and white, and yet he's probably the only Impressionist that used strong blacks and strong whites in his work. Most Impressionist works do not have that. Most Impressionist works have a lot more of soft blending. Manet doesn't really do anything soft here. We have men dressed in the traditional 1860s clothing, and yet we have one fully unclothed woman, and we have one woman back here in this diaphanous kind of floaty gown. And this, of course, is where the bathing reference comes from. So this is a contemporary picture. This picture is supposed to be in modern times, in the 1860s, when he paints it. And yet, you obviously wouldn't see a picnic scene like this in real life. So we have our naked woman here, again, perhaps a prostitute, but modeled by a model that Manet used quite frequently. Her name was Victorine Miron. And Victorine is here in full glory. We have another model here in the background. The perspective's a little wonky, actually, in this one. She doesn't look like she's as far back as we're supposed to think she is. She actually looks like she's kind of off kilter here in the front. So there's something kind of strange about the perspective. We have the picture framed by these big dark trees on either side, and we have light here in the background, but really the focus is on these three figures here in the front. So we have a lot of contradictions in this picture. We have that mythological looking goddess figure here in the back, but then we have the men and the woman here in modern dress or in complete undress, right? We also have nobody looking at each other. Everybody's looking in a different direction in this picture. Nobody is involved in the scene that's taking place. We have the accoutrements here that would take place in a picnic. We also have some allegory in this picture that I hadn't noticed until I was reading another analysis. We have a little finch here at the very top of the picture. Kind of hard to see. What would the finch perhaps stand for? Well, the finch probably is allegorical for the Holy Spirit, for God looking down on this lovely scene in a private glen, right? So we have our little finch up there. And then down here on the bottom, let's see if I can find him. Oh, way down here in the very bottom corner, we have a toad. Again, hard to spot, but why is the toad there? Probably just as a sense of humor. Manet's kind of poking fun at the fact that we're taking painting so seriously. So he's put those little figures in the picture just to kind of remind us that we're in a painting where anything can happen. This particular picture offended the public. They were calling the woman a hussy, and it was very scandalous. And again, it got people talking about the Salon Refusé and these Impressionist painters. So they labeled him avant-garde and brought Manet instant celebrity. So between Monet's Impression Sunrise and Manet's provocation of the naked women being shown to the public, we had quite a lot of talk going on about this movement and about the contemporary artists of the late 1800s. So Manet has shown Luncheon in the Grass and Olympia, and people are talking, but Monet and Manet, excuse me, I get them confused myself. Manet only sells 6 paintings prior to 1870. But in 1881, he is actually awarded a medal in the Salon. which is kind of like being a golf qualifier. Once you've earned a medal at the salon, you don't have to qualify anymore. You're given automatic entry. So from that moment forward, Manet was allowed to exhibit his work at any of the salons. So his last major masterpiece is this one. A little different than the others, right? Definitely a more palatable subject matter. This is called the Bar at the Folies Bergere. And yes, it takes place at the famous Folies Bergere. This was painted in 1882. It's an oil on canvas, and this piece gained him quite a bit of recognition and is definitely acknowledged as his final masterpiece of work. So what do we have here? We have a still life with people. So is it a portrait or is it a still life? Well, a little bit of both. But there are some elements in here that are really interesting and kind of wrong. Let's start first with the woman, smack in the middle of the painting, but she's being reflected by a mirror behind her. That's why we can see the back of her. But look where the reflection is. The reflection is off to the side, as if you, the viewer, is standing off to the side. But you're not, because she's staring at you front and center. So that's the first thing that's a little bit wonky about this. So now we've acknowledged that we have a mirror here behind the bar where she's serving. We have all the liquor bottles here in the front, and we have the crowd reflected in the mirror. So the foreground of the picture is actually the background of the picture. In other words, the crowd is actually sitting here where you, the viewer, are, but it's reflected in the background of the picture because of the mirror. Very interesting, right? We also have our little trapeze feet here in the very upper corner of the picture. Again, he's put in the entertainment that's occurring at the Folies Bergere, but he's just given us the little truncated feet of the trapeze artist there, a little touch of humor. So a couple other things in this picture. He's demonstrated his ability to paint still life with this water reflected in the vase. He's also got his name painted on one of the bottles with his signature down here. It says Monet, and it has the date of 1882 painted as the labeling on one of the liquor bottles. So he incorporated all of these interesting aspects into this picture. He, of course, had to paint this in his studio. It was not painted on site at the Folies Bergere, but perhaps he would have been there and observed things and brought ideas back to his studio in order to incorporate them here. The woman is very singular, right? She's really the only person that we can focus on in this picture, but the rest of this picture has a lot of plurality. We have a lot going on. We have multiple bottles. We have oranges in a bowl. We have this huge crowd scene going on behind us. We even have multiple light fixtures in the picture, and yet the woman is the only thing that we're really focused on. So this picture has a lot going on to it. It also talks about the fact that flowers and fruit and life is perishable, and yet items are not. So there's a lot going on in this picture. The dog obviously objects to this. Manet dies from poor health in 1878. He's given the Legion of Honor medal by the country of France, and yes, he did die of syphilis, as my husband pointed out. So now we're going to do a bit of a contrast between Impression Sunrise and Luncheon on the Grass. So we're going to contrast these two pictures so that you really can get a clear image of the difference between Manet and Monet. Okay? A quote from Manet: "Painting is a matter of sight, not insight." So that's kind of the opposite approach to what Monet would do. Manet is saying that you're going to paint what you see. Monet is going to paint more about what he feels and how he thinks. So, other differences. Manet would paint in the studio. He would not paint outdoors like Monet. He would paint everything in one sitting. He didn't paint in layers, and he didn't glaze his final work. So he would paint everything at once. And if he didn't like what he painted, he would just paint over it. Oil paint allows you to scrape off and then just repaint. So we have lots of layers to Manet's painting that curators and restorers can see with X-ray and all the technology available today. Manet plays with tones and color and values, and he patches those colors, but he has little use for shadow or gradation. We call that tackism, T-A-C-H-I-S-M. Tackism means a spot or a blot of paint, and we see that in his bold use of color here in Luncheon in the Grass. He has a lot of things in his pictures, right? There's a big volume of elements in his picture. He has people, he has landscape, he has trees, he has bathers, he has all kinds of items and objects in the pictures. And his pictures, he uses people as the subject and more photographic-like as opposed to the impressions we see in the sunrise. He uses a lot of black. We already talked about the fact that Manet uses a lot more black than most Impressionists would use. And he did decline the invitation to exhibit with the Impressionists the first time he was invited. So Manet joined the group a little bit later on. Manet was a very generous man. He actually, through his friendship with Monet, would often loan money to Monet, because you might recall Monet was always a little short on cash, and so Manet would help with that. Manet was a city boy. He preferred the city to the country, unlike Monet, who preferred the country. And Manet has a modernist style. He has modernity, is that a word? Versus traditional style. There's a little bit of tension in his work that comes from that modern approach. Now let's talk about Monet here with Impression's Sunrise. Monet is inspired by Manet's Rebellion, and that enables Monet to capture his own style. As I said, Monet focuses more on light and time, and he does use tackism, but he uses much smaller spots, almost in a pointillist fashion, where he layers colors next to each other in order to create the impression. He likes to paint series of subjects over time, unlike Manet, who paints all at once. He did influence Manet's bold subject matter, so they did influence each other quite a bit. But Monet uses very little black, and he uses nature as his subject instead of people, so that's a big difference right there. Monet definitely liked emotion and color in collaboration, and he looks at the color of the objects as opposed to the objects themselves. Manet has a much sharper focus on the objects. Monet's work is mood-provoking. Manet's work is more narrative. Monet, as I said, was terrible with money and often had to borrow from Manet. And Monet preferred the country to the city. So we have very different brush strokes in each of the works. If we look at the two pieces together, you can see that we have much more definable, definitive brush strokes in the Monet work as opposed to the Manet work. But they did hang out together, and they were friends, and they were considered part of the same Impressionist group of artists. They were lifelong friends. They had the same art dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel. They both spent time in the Refuge for Impressionists, which was out in Argenteuil, and they worked together out there in 1874, and they were both heavily influenced by Japanese art of the day. So, one last piece I want to show you is Monet painting an homage to Manet with his version of Luncheon on the Grass. We can see it's very different than Manet's version, right? And yet you wouldn't necessarily call this a Monet work because he didn't often paint people, and yet we have people in this picture. So this was Monet's homage to Manet. We have, of course, Latour's homage to both Manet and Monet that we started our talk with today. And I hope that you can at least take some differences between the two and apply them in your art viewing. It's been a pleasure having the talk with you. I so wish that I was able to do this in person, and I look forward to the time that I can. I hope you all stay well. I welcome your feedback, and I'll bring you another talk soon. Take care.